So You'll Never Find Me is a movie that I believe came out in 2023, did really well at a bunch of festivals, and we finally got a Shudder release just a couple of months ago. Glad I could check it out. And in my circle of the internet, at least, where I hang out, like hidden gem lists, like scary movies, best movies of the year, all that type of stuff. This is a movie I kept seeing, the name of it. Kept saying, like, this is the movie of the year. It's the scariest movie of the year. I love this movie. Why is nobody talking about this movie? And this is 100% one of those movies you want to go into absolutely blind. You don't want to know anything about this movie. Don't watch the trailer for this movie. I'm going to keep this review very brief, not give any specifics away so that you can kind of see some of the surprises for yourself. And I've come to compare like all of the movies in that same category to Barbarian because a lot of people can probably relate to this. But when I was in the movie theater watching Barbarian, it was a movie I knew absolutely nothing about. About halfway through the movie, it twists and everyone's kind of like, what the fuck? Like, one of those movies. And this movie is very similar to that in tone. And the general premise of this movie follows this main character, Patrick, that you meet during the opening scene. And he's sitting there alone in his trailer park unit. It's like very late at night. He's drinking. And something is definitely off about this guy to the viewer. Like, he's anxious. He's look over your shoulder type. Like, something is unsettling about this guy, and there's something creeping this guy out. You don't really know what's going on. And at the same time, there's a violent storm going on outside. It's like a very bad thunderstorm, one of those like debilitating storms that would keep you trapped inside, where if you ever saw anybody out in it, you'd be unsettled immediately because it's like, why would somebody go out in the storm that violent? And the same night that this violent storm's happening, you have this very like creepy, unsettling, like in a subtle way, girl show up to his unit. She's banging on the door looking for shelter and warmth. She's trapped in the storm. He kind of like reluctantly lets her in. It's kind of weird to him at 2 a.m. She's at his unit. And after she arrives, the two start to converse for a while, and they both kind of get equally uncomfortable with one another. Like, they're both not certain of the other one. And she wants to leave, but there's always a reason she can't. And he wants her to leave, but there's always a reason she won't. So it's kind of an equal standoff of like, who's in the wrong here? And that's the first thing I'm going to say about this movie immediately. This is not going to be a movie for everyone. I see this movie being a very love or hate type of movie where you're going to have people who love slow burn, like psychological horror, like scary movies like that. They might get really in on this movie like I was, but you're going to have a lot of people who are bored shitless by this movie. I mean, this is a movie that's very heavy on the dialogue. It's very heavy on the tension building. So for that reason, you're going to fall into one of the two camps, I would believe. But you do spend almost the entirety of the runtime with these two characters. You have Patrick and the girl you don't know, and they're equally weird, which is where this movie excels greatly, in my opinion, where you have two characters that for the general premise of it, you really don't know who to trust or like why either of them is acting the way they're acting. And I take some issues with how they go about this, but for the most part, I think the premise, incredibly original. One of the issues I did take with this movie is that as much as I was a fan of the dialogue in this movie and I was invested in the story, the two characters are almost like over the top creepy. It's almost like the dialogue was written in a way to make them both over the top suspicious in the way they converse. I know it sells the premise of the movie, but it's just something to look out for because to me, there was a couple conversations in this movie that did not come off natural to me. Earlier on, I compared this movie to Barbarian, and that's for a couple of reasons. One, I think you go into this movie blind. You don't want to know anything about it, best experience. Two, Barbarian has like a huge tonal shift about halfway through, and you'll know if you've seen that movie. I'm not going to spoil it. But I thought Barbarian's like first hour or so, some of the scariest movie I've ever seen. I thought it was nightmare fuel. It was amazing. And this movie's very similar to that. And what I mean by that's, it's like a 90-minute movie or so, but the first hour or so of this movie, in my opinion, like the way the dialogue structured, the filming, things like that, absolutely terrifying, in my opinion. Like, I thought the first hour or so of this movie is absolutely phenomenal. Like, one of, if not the best horror movies I've seen in ages. Like, since I can remember, honestly, like where I thought the first hour or so was very, very immersive to me. Absolutely loved it. And it's for two reasons in particular I thought the first hour or so of this movie was so effective. That's the sound design and the cinematography, which is, nothing strange about horror movies and what makes them effective. The way this movie sounds and the way this movie looks completely elevates a very, very generic premise, and that is having two people sit in the same room, having like a cup of coffee or something, talking, but making it incredibly tense. And they do that through a lot of very smart strategic choices. The camera work in this movie, in my opinion, is basically genius. And if you've watched a lot of horror movies, you know how important that is to frame things a certain way, because this is the premise of a movie. It could have been absolutely boring, like snooze-inducing boring, because if they filmed it a certain way where it was very generic and you're just looking at the two people, you would basically have no tension because you'd see everything on screen. This movie is filmed so smart. The technical choices in this movie and the way they went about filming the tension in this movie really set this movie a notch above a lot of other horror movies, especially ones that have tried the premise. And some of the examples of that would be, like when you have two people sitting in a room conversing and they're both equally uncomfortable, you don't know who to trust, are they both good, both bad, things like that. It can easily get boring when you don't really feel like there's risk at play for both of the characters, but I feel like the first hour of this movie found a perfect blend of making both of the people equally weird to the point where you're kind of like, why are you two talking to each other like this? Like both of you guys are hiding something. You'll have these scenes that are incredibly generic, like two people playing cards, having a cup of coffee, talking. And the way they frame the background, the way they focus, the way they slow pan the camera really makes it tense, like to the point where I was really on board with this. When you have two people playing cards and you have a hallway behind one of them that's completely pitch black during the conversation, it just draws your eyes to it. Like, what's in the hallway? Why does it keep showing me that? There's a scene where a guy asks a girl to take a shower if she wants to warm up. And it's unsettling because you're not sure if this guy's a creep or not. You're not sure if she's a creep. But when she does take a shower, it's kind of like a lot of slow pans to the door. Like, is somebody on the other side of the door? It's filmed from a perspective of it doesn't show you the door. So you're like, is he already on the other side of the door, listening through the door? Did he walk through the door? There's a lot of things that it's hard to explain without watching it. I don't want to spoil too much, but I thought it was phenomenal. The sound design is equally as good as the visual designs in this movie, in my opinion. Like the thunder's ripping in the background, you got loud banging on the doors. Does not let up with the fact that something really sinister is going on. You're just not really sure of what it is, but it keeps the vibe up entirely because you don't really go more than like a minute or two without being reminded you're in a situation you cannot leave. And since this movie is so low scale, like it all takes place in one room for the most part, I thought the acting in this movie, very, very good. And that's because when you have two characters like that need to occupy the screen for the entire movie, you're asked to play a lot of emotions within the same character. Like you need to be creepy, you need to be sympathetic, kind of like emotional, maybe scared. I think both of these characters and the way they manipulate their eyes, like body language, well above average in scary movies. I think the acting is very good. And while I thought Patrick, the main character, is particularly creepy in the way he delivers some of his lines and the way he kind of gives body language cues, I thought the girl in this movie was phenomenal at displaying fear and also like a sense of creepiness. When I watched this movie, something was always off about her, and I think her subtlety is the reason that was. Again, just a shout out, I thought the acting very good for these type of movies. And when you get into the story of this movie, I think they gave you just enough Easter eggs to kind of figure out what's going on halfway through. I personally didn't figure this movie out. I thought they were going an entirely different way with this movie, like what the premise was going to end up being, but I was wrong. But that's good. I mean, it kept me on my toes in that regard. Can't say I kind of agree with where it went compared to where I thought it was going to go. But in hindsight, especially when you start getting more and more clues, you can kind of start to get a little bit of a glimpse of where this is going to go. I think it's subtle, but I think it's good enough that you can, as an audience, kind of pick up what's going on. Really enjoyed that. But when it gets to the main gripe I have with this movie, and it's going to be the vast majority of the things with this movie, it's like the third act ending of this movie. I don't think it's like terribly bad, but when you compare it to how effective the first hour of this movie is, it is a pretty big letdown, in my opinion, of like where it could have gone, where it ends up going. And whatever you want to call it, like an ending, a final act, the final 20 minutes or so of this movie, it fails for two reasons, in my opinion. I guess fail's kind of a bad word, but it doesn't really work for a couple of reasons for me, because I think to a lot of people, the ending of this movie, like the final 20 minutes, like it's going to undermine the tension of the entire first hour, where you're going to watch the first hour, think it's very, very good. And then the ending's kind of, because of the route they choose to go, the way they kind of conclude it, you're going to feel like that tension was for naught. Like it didn't add up to anything. I think that's one possibility. But the second main reason that this movie's ending doesn't really work for me, and I think a lot of people are going to feel this way as well, is the second half of the movie has to be compared to the first half of the movie. The movie's holistic. And I don't think the second half of the movie really holds up at all to the first half of the movie. I thought the first half of the movie was a lot better. So for that reason, it's like no fault of its own. The first half is that good. But the ending of the movie feels a lot more generic, a lot more tropey, like you can figure it out. So in that regard, it's pretty big letdown. I definitely don't think the ending of this movie like ruins this movie. It's not like an abomination or anything. It's just not as good as it could be. It's going to ruin the movie for some people. It didn't do that for me. I mean, I definitely think this movie's worth checking out because the first hour or so of this movie is that damn good. Like, it's some of the most tense movie I've seen in a very long time. So overall, I'll say I think You'll Never Find Me is kind of a mixed bag. Like, you'll have people who think this movie's boring as dirt. I'm not one of them. I think the first hour or so of this movie especially is incredibly engaging. I love the first hour or so of this movie. I don't think the ending particularly works, but it doesn't mean the movie's terrible in general. If you're a fan of horror movies, slow burns, psychological movies with dialogue, chamber pieces that take place in one room, I think you should really check this movie out. I think it's well above average in that regard, something original, unique. Even though the ending of this movie stalls out a little bit compared to the beginning of the movie, I still think it gets to a point where you could do worse, and you definitely have. First half of this movie is definitely good enough that I'll agree with the whole hidden gem, like why are more people not talking about this? I mean, that shit was great. So if you've seen or heard of this movie, You'll Never Find Me, if you have, comment down below, let me know. If you haven't seen You'll Never Find Me and you don't find it interesting, you're not a fan of those like slow-paced chamber piece movies, comment down below. Just let me know what your favorite Shudder movie is you think deserves more hype. As always, if you haven't subscribed yet, what the hell are you waiting for? More scary stuff, more new release videos to come. I do them both. That's all I got in this video. Peace.